Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. And before I welcome my next guest, I'm proud to announce this episode is brought to you by Writing New South Wales, a Talking Aussie Books partner for 2022. Writing New South Wales is the peak body for writers and writing in New South Wales. They aim to support writers by helping them navigate the publishing industry and build long-lasting careers. Writing New South Wales aims to promote a vibrant and diverse writing culture through courses and events by providing information and advocacy along with networking opportunities. To find out more about this wonderful organisation, you can visit writingnewsouthwales.org.au. Better still, avoid missing out on important industry information, course enrolments and other opportunities by signing up to Newsbite, the Writing New South Wales weekly e-newsletter. Maryrose Cuskelly is an award-winning Melbourne-based author who originally hails from Queensland. She is a writer of both non-fiction and fiction, and listeners, I've just finished reading her debut novel, The Cane. Published by Allen Unwin, The Cane is a gripping, atmospheric crime novel set in the fictional sugar town of Quala in North Queensland in the 1970s. A local girl has gone missing just before the beginning of the sugar crush season. Parents are on edge. The threat of the unknown danger to their children hangs over the town, and as the investigation ramps up, the community becomes increasingly mistrustful and divided. Convinced that the girl has met with foul play at the hands of a local, tensions rising to a breaking point as the crush inevitably gets underway. Listeners, this was a terrific read that had me guessing till the very end, and I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with Maryrose about her book on the podcast today. Welcome, Maryrose.
Thank you, Claudine. I'm really happy to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And I wanted to say congratulations on the release of your debut novel. I know that you're no stranger to the publishing world, having had a couple of non-fiction titles published before, but does it feel different with this one?
It does a bit, and I think just because crime fiction is such a, avidly read genre, there's been more attention on this book than other books. So that's been really exciting. And there's such a community of Australian crime writers as well. So it's kind of a little bit trepidatious, but also kind of quite exciting to, step into that realm. Yeah.
Now, I understand the initial seeds of inspiration for this book go a long way back. So I wondered if you could tell us more about this and how you came to be writing this particular story.
Sure. Look, it's just over 50 years since a young girl called Marilyn Woolman went missing near Imeo, which is near Mackay, so in North Queensland. And I was a kid when that happened growing up in Queensland, even though I grew up in the southeast corner of the state. And Marilyn lived much further north. But it was because I was a country kid walking to school, and it was just one of those events that it certainly gripped Queensland and, probably ricocheted kind of all around Australia. Parents everywhere, I dare say, were nervous about their kids because she disappeared so utterly. She was, riding her bike down a track between two cane fields towards the main road to catch the bus into Mackay. And 10 minutes after she left, her younger brothers, who went to the local primary school, found her bicycle lying on its side. The front wheel was still spinning and Marilyn had just disappeared. So I think there's just something so kind of vivid about that image, and that was one thing about it that really lodged with me. And also I think just that general anxiety that my parents and the other adults in my life had at that time, and because it was a crime that has never been solved. And in fact, over the years, her family have very successfully kept her name in the public consciousness and have lobbied governments to have rewards offered for people to give if they come forward with any information that leads to the identification of a suspect. So because it has bubbled along over the years as well, and just because I'm attuned to it, whenever it appears in the news, it would come up for me again. And so in 2014, I started thinking seriously about writing something about it, and I was thinking in the realms of nonfiction. And I did make contact with the family, but in the end, they weren't really willing to engage in a process to write a nonfiction book, which was completely understandable. I ended up writing an essay, which I had shown to the family, and they were quite happy for me to publish that, which won the Thunderbolt Award. And so at the time, so that was in 2016, and so at the time I thought, oh, well, that's it. I've written about it. It's done. But I kept thinking about the story. I kept thinking about my memories of that time. I kept thinking about the 1970s and what a era, kind of tumult and cultural change it was. And so I was just drawn back to it, and The Cane is the result. And so The Cane isn't an attempt to tell the story of Marilyn or her family, but it begins with a similar crime in a similar landscape.
As I indicated in my introduction, the book was set in the 70s, and you've just alluded to that as well. And it was a time, as you've just said, a time of great social upheaval for Australians, a time of changing attitudes, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so. And I've got 6 siblings, and most of which are older than me. So I had siblings who were adults, young adults at that time. And so they were living in these share houses in Brisbane and going to demos and coming back home and arguing with my parents about politics because, Gough Whitlam was about to be elected, and Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who was a very conservative, authoritarian figure, was Premier in Queensland. So I think... So I was, even though I wasn't at the time terribly, like as a child, terribly aware of what all the implications and the issues were, I was still aware of that kind of excitement and movement. And, a son of my parents' good friends was, drafted to go to Vietnam, things like that. So there were issues that would just, be talked about in the household. And it just was such a rich vein to explore. And so I really wanted to kind of try and present the era as well as this story of a girl going missing and what that impact would be on a community.
And on that point, I loved that the book explored the events leading up to and surrounding the disappearance of Janet McClement from so many different points of view. And I think these different points of view helped me gauge the temperature of the town. So it was like their attitudes on a variety of different subjects: women, career women in particular, Indigenous people, islanders, the wider mores of Australian society, and even communism, as you've just mentioned. So the overall effect for me as a reader it wasn't just about investigating the disappearance of Janet. It was about peeling back the layers of Australian society to reveal what lay underneath, wasn't it?
Yes, I was really interested in a disappearance and a crime like that has on community, but I was also interested in the community itself and the times. And I suppose I had quite a lot of different perspectives. In fact, I started off with a few more in my original manuscript, and my editor suggested, maybe just not have quite so many people talking to us, which I think was good advice. And having all those perspectives, I think it just allowed me to, so the reader gets an idea of the effect it has on the children in the district, on the friends of Janet, on her boyfriend, on, the other adults, on the teachers, on the wider society. So I think initially it was kind of, that decision was more intuitive to write from different perspectives. And then we also have most of the novel is told in third person, but there is this first person narrator as well. Arthur, he's a character who's an older man, and he almost acts like a Greek chorus. He kind of can give us an understanding of the town, of the era, of the history of the place, which does include, like most places in Australia, the dispersals of Aboriginal people and, perhaps massacres, and in particularly in North Queensland, how South Sea Islanders were brought to Australia, not always willingly or with full knowledge of what they were being expected to do, to work in the cane fields. And so Arthur's voice allowed me to do that as well.
Maryrose, I wanted to ask you if you encountered any limitations in your storytelling by setting it in the 1970s, do you think?
I suppose the limits of just trying to be authentic in the way writing a town and a community that felt authentic and characters that felt authentic, and just even like the sound of the voices of the people. I suppose they were kind of really the only limitations I felt. And in fact, I found it it was quite freeing. Like there's kind of a bit of a trope, that mobile phones, they're like a death knell for crime fiction because everybody knows where everybody is at any given time. Like you really have to work around the technology. While with the 1970s, no mobile phones, no one knows where you are. So in some ways it was quite freeing, I think, not have to grapple with technology like that.
Senior Constable Carmel Maitland was an interesting character, a police officer who was brought into the investigation as more of a women's liaison officer by Detective Patterson rather than as someone to help with the heavy lifting of the investigation. And the comments and behaviour she had to put up with as a plainclothes officer at that time were simply outrageous. So I wanted to ask you, was she inspired by anyone in particular, and how did you get inside her head?
Well, when I was researching the book, I went to the State Library of Victoria and got all the, the newspapers of the time, and particularly around the time of the disappearance of Marilyn Woolman. And I was just, flicking through the photos and that sort of thing. And there was a photograph of a policewoman who had been brought up from Brisbane, and she was kind of sitting beside, it wasn't a whiteboard, but it was a notice board of some sort with, diagrams of the area where Marilyn had disappeared, arrows and cars and things like that. And she was kind of wearing a safari suit type of thing. I was just struck by that. And that image, that was another one of those images that just stayed with me. And so I just thought, well, it would have been really interesting as a woman. She wasn't, she was quite a young woman. And then when I went back and I was just researching, women in the police force in the 1970s, there'd only been uniformed police women in the Queensland police force since, I won't have the date exactly right, but it was something like 1967, 1968. So having uniformed women in the police force, or women just being active police officers rather than just, working in admin or whatever, was still quite new. I can recall people saying things like that, married women women in the workforce took away jobs from married men. And those kind of comments that Carmel is subject to, they're not exaggerated at all. Not at all. And look, I can remember, I went to a Catholic boarding school. I had an economics teacher who was a Catholic priest. And I remember him saying, not once, but on several occasions, that it was less economical to employ women because, every month they had to take a few days off because, women's problems, that sort of thing. So outrageous, and yes, absolutely par for the course in the 70s. Yeah.
The landscape of the sugar fields, or the sugarcane fields, is integral to this novel, and you managed to evoke the slightly menacing character of these fields that dominate the sugar towns, and the way they surround the houses separated by fire breaks and tracks. It's almost, I want to say claustrophobic, but I mean, that's how I felt. What I wanted to say was, why there, and what research did you do to bring the town of Quala alive on the page?
Look, I like I said, I went to boarding school, and some of my friends grew up in that part of the world, so I had been up there, and I have been up there, other times as well, holidaying or whatever. And the cane is like, it's ubiquitous, like it just covers the landscape. It's not unbeautiful, like there's something, that kind of this greenness and just the way it moves in the wind and that sort of thing. But it's also like its very ubiquity is kind of a bit, well, it's alien and a bit creepy. And there's something about Queensland and North Queensland, and particularly back in the 70s, like I said, when Joh Bjelke-Petersen was Premier, he really encouraged this idea of Queensland as people apart. It was a kind of a frontier, and Queenslanders were, direct and independent and all this sort of thing. And Queensland was a little bit, it was remote, like North Queensland was remote. And there's something about the humidity, the heat. There is this inherent kind of, well, particularly if, when you're an alien in that landscape, there can be something a little bit creepy about it. And also I was interested in this idea, like the cane is almost a character in itself, and it has this malevolent presence. And like often when something terrible happens in a community, particularly a small community, there's this narrative that, you know, our innocence has been stolen because of this terrible event. And I just question whether there's anywhere in Australia that can say we're innocent, like terrible things have happened on this land. And so the cane became kind of an avatar for that, like for the destruction of the environment, for the dispersal of Aboriginal people and the stealing of their land, the forced labour of South Sea Islanders. It's kind of a fanciful idea, but, you know, what happens to a landscape when there are these repeated desecrations, I suppose. And so the cane was a way to embody that menace and sense that terrible things have happened here, not once, but multiple times.
Teenagers and education of teenagers, along with sexual awakening, is something you address in this book too. In amongst this overwhelming fear that the town parents have for their children's safety in the wake of Janet's disappearance, there's an undercurrent of rebelliousness in the youth that has little heed for the danger that lurks. Essie, one of the characters, though she's still a primary school age child, is entering puberty and being thrown into the same campus with many older kids. And she witnesses firsthand this awakening amongst her peers, and particularly Raylene Mason. So I guess I wanted to ask you about that, but I also wanted to ask you about the Little Red School Book and why you brought this into this story. Because, look, I have to say, for such a controversial text, I'd never heard of it before. So tell me about that and why it was important to you to include that in this story.
Yeah, I guess when I was researching, one of the things that I would do when I was looking through the newspapers at the time was just have a bit of a look at the letters to the editor, because they were a great barometer of what was occupying people's minds, what was outraging them, what was, you know, upsetting them. And the Little Red School Book came up again and again. And I had, you know, vague, I don't think, you know, I never saw a Little Red School Book back then. And I don't think one would have ever made it into our house. So I just began to read a bit about it, and it was quite incredible. So, you know, it was written by these two Danish school teachers, and it was about giving young people kind of power and agency in their life. So while a lot of the upset and furor was about the information it gave about sex and drugs, that was by no means the only thing that was in the book. It also spoke to young people about how to organise, like how to mount a demonstration, how to get together a delegation and approach, you know, like people in authority and say, we don't, you know, we're not going to stand for this. You can't treat us like this, or we want to participate more fully. So it was about educating young people about their own power, really. So it was just a wonderful vehicle to insert another subplot into the novel. And because it does have that veracity, like it was a thing that existed, and I had to go to the Ballieu Library, which is at the University of Melbourne here, to find a copy, and I had to, you know, put on my white gloves, and it was, you know, open it on a pillow so as not to break the spine, but it's just like a little, you know, pamphlet sort of thing. So, but no, I urge everyone to read it and to give it to their children.
It's recently been republished, I believe.
Well, it was translated into all these different languages, and it was the importation of it was banned into Australia, but then they started to publish it in Australia, and it was banned from schools, but, you know, it still managed to work its way around the place.
Indeed. Now, I mean, the character of Raylene Mason was a very interesting one. And I think, you know, as a parent, I kind of wanted to grab her by the scruff of the neck and go, what are you doing? She was almost defiant. It was almost like she was flipping the bird at, you know, authoritarian figures around the town, saying, I'll do what I want. And her father just didn't seem to care that she was out there, and the fact that he owned the pub and that there were men around all the time, he just didn't seem to be cognizant of the danger to her, don't you think?
Look, I suppose Raylene came from, you know, I remember girls like that, you know, girls who had that kind of early sexual awakening and who were so kind of brazen and, you know, just I don't know, this kind of fearlessness or something. And as a younger kid looking at these older girls, I was just so admiring of them. And there was a part of me that wanted to be like them, but it was just never going to. I just never had that sense of rebellion. So I suppose, yeah, she comes from, I think, I knew there was a few girls that, I knew like that. And there was that sense of danger about them, not just that they were a danger to themselves, but that they would, they were a danger to, well, I think adults particularly saw them as a danger to the others, they're to other children and things like that. So, and I think the 70s, not in my family, but I know, speaking to friends and things like that, the 70s, there was this kind of idea that kids were, adults weren't as close, weren't as attentive to children as we are now. And, kids did kind of roam free a bit, and adults were kind of preoccupied with their own affairs. I mean, literally, and in a more general sense, there was that adults, there were adults who were also kind of, discovering. It wasn't just kids who were kind of going, finding these newfound freedoms. I think there were adults who were going, oh, hang on, do I have to live my life the way, I was brought up? And so I think there was a bit more looseness. And I think, Raylene, her mother's absent. So, yeah, she's a disruptive force, Raylene. And, but I do love her and fear for her at the same time.
Maryrose, if there was one thing you would like readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
One thing that when I was writing the book, I didn't want the disappearance of Janet just to be the inciting event, if you like. I wanted her disappearance and the kind of the grief and the dread that leaves behind with her parents and in the community to be something like a presence throughout the book. And I suppose, I hope I've done that readers don't lose that sense that this terrible thing has happened, this girl has disappeared, and that grief is real, I suppose, and resonates throughout the book.
Maryrose, you may know that there are lots of writers who listen to this podcast, and I wondered, given your experiences in both the non-fiction and fiction sphere, if you had any tips to offer those who are looking to write a novel or looking to have their novel published.
For writers of, any genre or would-be writers, I think reading is obviously really important, and to read really widely across all genres, and literary fiction to genre fiction to non-fiction, to really just have a look at the ways, like anything is kind of possible in writing, and there are lots of different ways to make your writing a success and to make it vivid. And in the end you have to find your own way, but you can really get a lot of ideas and guidances from reading very widely. And in terms of getting things published, there's luck involved, but there's also, you just have to, I do a little bit of manuscript assessing, and drafting and redrafting is really important. Like, get that first draft down really quickly, but then you need to spend at least as much time and probably more drafting and redrafting. And only then, when you really think you've done all you can with it, that's when you submit it to a publisher or submit it to an agent. My last book was Wedderburn, which was a true crime book. I really wanted the best, chance for it. And so I went to, just things like the Australian Society of Authors runs pitching workshops. They run also events, speed literary dating, where you can kind of pitch your manuscript to agents and publishers. And they're really good ways to just, it's kind of like a really good reality check. Am I hitting the mark with what the story is, with how I'm presenting it? So I would really encourage people, if they can access things like that, like pitching workshops, literary dating events, because it really just, it's a good sounding board. Am I on the right track? Have I got something here that's got legs?
Are you working on something else at the moment, Maryrose?
Yes, I'm working on a novel, and I'm just at that stage where I'm tearing my hair out about it, and I hate it. And so, a manuscript is a series of decisions, and so I'm just trying to go back and make some different decisions. Yeah, so it's this time it's contemporary. It's got a contemporary setting and an urban setting, but I kind of don't really want to talk too much about it because, as I said, I'm kind of in the weeds with it at the moment.
Fantastic. Maryrose, if people or if listeners out there wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram at Maryrose Cuskelly and also on Facebook, Maryrose Cuskelly author. I have a website, maryrosecuskelly.com.au.
Maryrose, I thoroughly enjoyed reading The Cane. Congratulations once more on its publication. I wish you every success with it and the books that no doubt will follow. And thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books this morning.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Claudine, and thank you for your questions and your really close engagement with the book. I really appreciate it.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.